Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Every election cycle has its hot button issues, and this time around it seems like the intersection of faith and politics is particularly charged. We're seeing it everywhere we look, and it's a lot more nuanced than those quick headlines might suggest. So buckle up, because today we're going beyond the surface and really digging into this complex landscape, specifically how some Christians in the U.S. see their role in this upcoming election.
And it's fascinating how this goes beyond just voting your values, which we hear a lot. This goes deeper, almost like a moral obligation to shape the outcome.
Right. And to get into that mindset, we're diving deep into this article, The Call to Action, Why Christians Must Stand Firm and Take Action in Today's World. Now, just to be clear, this is one perspective among many. We're not saying everyone agrees with it, but exploring the why behind it can be really illuminating. What's the main argument here?
In a nutshell, it's saying that simply voting isn't enough. Christians, according to this article, need to be active participants in the political process, specifically by supporting candidates who align with what they see as biblical values.
Which makes sense, right? People do that all the time, voting based on what matters to them. But there's this added layer of urgency here. It's almost like they're saying, look, if you don't get involved, something bad will happen, which kind of raises the stakes, don't you think?
Absolutely. And that's where it gets interesting because the article doesn't shy away from specifics. It lays out a clear contrast between the Republican and Democratic parties, particularly on issues like abortion. For example, it brings up the overturning of Roe v. Wade, framing the Republican Party as more aligned with the view that life begins at conception. It even quotes Psalm 139.1316, which talks about God forming us in the womb. This is very much about connecting those beliefs to real-world political stances.
So, for people who hold that belief deeply, it's not just an abstract political debate, it's about protecting something sacred. But we know this is a hugely complex issue with a spectrum of views, even within Christianity itself.
Exactly. And the article does acknowledge that diversity of thought within the Christian community, but it stresses that this particular call to action is directed at those who believe that life begins at conception. It argues that for them, supporting the Republican Party's stance is paramount. This idea of protecting religious organizations from government overreach is another key point. They use the term religious freedom a lot.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What does religious freedom look like in practice, according to the article?
They bring up some really specific examples. For instance, they're concerned about situations where religious organizations might be forced to act against their beliefs because of government mandates. One area they highlight is healthcare, specifically mentioning things like contraception and abortion coverage. They argue that the Republican Party is more likely to protect religious groups from having to provide services that directly contradict their beliefs.
Got it. So it's about ensuring that, for example, a religious hospital wouldn't be forced to perform abortions if it goes against their core beliefs. They feel like the Republican Party would be more likely to create those kinds of protections. And this isn't just hypothetical. These are real-world legal battles that have played out and continue to play out in courtrooms across the country.
Exactly. The article even mentions specific cases, like the Little Sisters of the Poor case, which involved a Catholic order that objected to providing contraceptive coverage in their employee health insurance. These aren't just abstract concepts. They're real-world situations where people feel like their religious freedom is being challenged.
And just to be clear, we're not taking sides here, but I think it's crucial to understand the legal and political context surrounding these issues. Okay, so we've got abortion and religious freedom. What other key areas do they highlight?
Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, traditional marriage and family values are a major focus. The article really emphasizes this idea of a traditional family structure, defining marriage as between one man and one woman, and argues that it's under attack.
And they back that up with biblical references, right? I'm noticing a pattern here.
Exactly. They cite passages like Genesis 1.27 and Ephesians 5.31, which talk about God creating man and woman in the husband-wife relationship. And they argue that the Republican Party's stance on same-sex marriage aligns more closely with this traditional view. They contrast this with what they see as the Democratic Party's more progressive stance on LGBTQ rights and same-sex marriage, which they frame as a departure from this traditional, biblically based definition of marriage.
So again, we're seeing that direct link between religious beliefs and political stances. They're saying this is what we believe because of our faith, and therefore this is the party whose policies are more in line with our values. But it also raises the question of what it means for people who don't share those beliefs. If one party is seen as the defender of these specific values, where does that leave everyone else? It's definitely adding another layer of complexity to this election, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's a good reminder that for many people, these aren't just theoretical debates. They're deeply personal issues tied to their faith, their identity, and how they live their lives. And it's these deeply held beliefs that this article is trying to tap into to mobilize people politically.
And it's not stopping there. They go on to cover a whole range of what they call moral and ethical issues, right?
Right. Things like euthanasia, assisted suicide, even stem cell research. They see the Republican Party as more aligned with Christian ethics on these, which they often frame in terms of the sanctity of life, echoing that earlier conversation about abortion.
It's interesting because they're drawing this connection between these different issues, saying, look, it's all connected by this overarching framework of how we view life, death, and morality. They contrast this with what they perceive as the Democratic Party's focus on individual autonomy and choice, which they argue can sometimes clash with these specific Christian beliefs. So they're painting a pretty stark picture, but isn't that part of what makes this so compelling? These are big questions with no easy answers, and people are trying to figure out where they stand.
And that's what this article is trying to tap into, that desire to, like, align your actions with your beliefs.
Yeah.
It's explicitly saying, if you believe these things, you can't just sit on the sidelines.
Which brings up a huge question, and frankly, it's what I was thinking about the whole time I was reading this. What kind of impact could this actually have on the election? We're talking about potentially mobilizing a significant portion of the electorate.
This is the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
We can't predict the future, but we can, like, look to the past for some clues.
Right.
Think about the moral majority movement back in the 1980s that was all about galvanizing conservative Christian voters around issues like abortion and school prayer. It had a huge impact on American politics, and some argue that we're seeing a resurgence of that kind of religiously motivated political engagement today.
Which makes this article even more relevant, right? It's not just some isolated thing, it's tapping into a much larger trend.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to understand the potential consequences. On the one hand, you could see this kind of mobilization leading to increased voter turnout, particularly among demographics that might not typically be as politically active.
Right, like if people who haven't been engaged before suddenly feel like, this is it, this election is make or break for the things I care about.
Precisely. But on the other hand, there's also the risk of deepening political divisions, right? When people feel like their deeply held beliefs are under attack, it can make it harder to find common ground with those who hold different views.
That's a really good point. It's one thing to debate tax policy, but when you bring faith and deeply held moral beliefs into the mix, the stakes feel so much higher.
Absolutely. And that's something this article really underscores, the intensity of feeling around these issues. It explicitly frames the upcoming election as a battle for the soul of America, with Christian values on one side and what they call secular humanism on the other.
And that kind of language can be really powerful, can it? It creates a sense of urgency, like this is an existential threat that requires immediate action.
Right. And that's where things can get tricky. Because while this article frames its call to action in moral terms, the reality of politics is messy and complex. There are always trade-offs, compromises to be made. It's rarely as black and white as it's often presented.
So true. And that's something for all of us to keep in mind, no matter what side of the political spectrum we fall on. But let's bring it back to this specific call to action. If it's successful in mobilizing a large number of Christian voters, what does that mean for people who don't share those same beliefs? What happens to their voices in this equation?
That's a critical question, and one that the article itself doesn't really address. It focuses solely on encouraging one specific group to engage politically, but it doesn't really grapple with the potential implications for those who hold different views.
Which is something we as engaged citizens need to be thinking about, right? It's like, how do we ensure that our political system remains inclusive and representative, even when certain groups become more politically active?
Exactly. And it's not about silencing any one group's voice. It's about ensuring that all voices are heard and considered. It's about having those difficult conversations, even when we disagree, and trying to find common ground where we can.
Because ultimately, that's what a healthy democracy is all about, isn't it? Being able to have these conversations even when they're tough and finding ways to move forward together.
Absolutely. And that requires empathy, understanding, and a willingness to listen to perspectives that might be different from our own.
Which is a great segue into my next thought. We've talked a lot about how this article frames things, but now I'm curious about your take on all of this. As someone who studies this stuff, what stands out to you about this particular call to action? What makes it unique or significant in the broader context of faith and politics?
That's a great question. I think one thing that makes this particular call to action stand out is its explicit focus on policy over personality. In past elections, we've often seen religious groups rallying behind candidates who are seen as personally devout or morally upright, even if their policy positions don't always align with those values.
You're right. It's that whole idea of voting for a good person versus voting for someone based on their stance on specific issues.
Exactly. And this article is saying, look, it's not enough for a candidate to just talk about their faith, their actions, their voting record, their policy positions. That's what really matters.
So it's less about symbolism and more about concrete action.
Yes, and I think that reflects a broader shift we're seeing in American politics, where people are becoming more issue-driven, less willing to compromise on certain core beliefs.
Which is both encouraging and a little concerning, right? On the one hand, it's great that people are getting more engaged. But on the other hand, if we're all digging in our heels and refusing to budge on anything, how do we find common ground?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something we all need to be grappling with as we navigate this increasingly complex political landscape.
Yeah, and it feels like, I don't know, a bit of a slippery slope in a way. Like, where do we draw the line?
It's tough,
Yeah.
right? Because on the one hand, we want people to be engaged, we want them to care about these issues. But yeah, when does it become, like, too much? When does it start to undermine that very system we're all trying to participate in?
Right. It's like this article threw a spotlight on one particular corner of that intersection, but there's a whole lot more going on around it.
And it's constantly evolving. Think about how social media has changed the game. Like, it gives people a platform to express their views and connect with like-minded individuals in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
And that's probably a whole other deep dive right there. How social media is shaping not just how we think about these issues, but how we engage with them politically.
Totally. It's like this whole other layer of complexity has been added to the mix. It's not just about voting anymore. It's about online activism, social pressure, even things like boycotts and protests that are driven by these deeply held beliefs.
It's almost like everyone has a megaphone now. And that can be really powerful, but also potentially really divisive, right?
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to be informed, to understand the forces that are shaping our political landscape. Because whether we realize it or not, these issues affect all of us, regardless of our own personal beliefs.
Okay, so true. And it's not about saying everyone needs to agree, but at least try to understand where other people are coming from, what motivates them, what they care about.
Exactly. It's about empathy and understanding, even when we disagree. Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. The article we discussed focused on a call to action for one specific group of voters, urging them to get engaged based on their faith. But this raises a question for all of us.
Right.
What is our responsibility as engaged citizens in a democracy, no matter what our beliefs are?
Ooh, that's a good question to ponder, and hopefully something we all think about a little bit more as we head into this next election year.
It's easy to sit back and let others drive the conversation, but ultimately, the future is shaped by those who show up. So thanks for showing up with us today, and until next time, keep diving deep.